Hello, my name is Jerry Scott. I'm in Murfreesboro, Tennessee today, March 31st, 2000, to interview John R. Rucker. This interview is taking place as a part of the legal history project of the Fellows of the Tennessee Bar Foundation. Senator Rucker, you've been a lawyer now for more than 50 years, and I thought I'd begin this interview by asking you, what was the reason that you wanted to be a lawyer? What were the influences upon you?
Well, I guess it, Jerry, it goes back to my family. My great-grandfather was a lawyer and a judge. That was William S. McLemore from Franklin, Tennessee. He fought in the Civil War under Forrest, came back. He had been admitted to practice, I think, in 1952. He graduated from Cummins Law School, I think, and that's 1852 and 1851. And he then came to Murfreesboro after serving as a circuit judge in Franklin for 12 years and practiced law with his son-in-law, my grandfather, for whom I'm named, John Richardson. And John Richardson went to Cumberland in 1878, and he had been practicing law for a number of years with his brother when his father-in-law came from Franklin to be with him. And then later, after he was a judge for 30 years, I practiced law with him for 8 or 10 years. But the tradition of law in the family was very strong. And while my father was not a lawyer, not in any way, it was very strong. My grandfather, Richardson, was a dominating influence in all of his children and grandchildren's lives. And I suspect he's the one because I was the oldest grandchild named for him. He influenced me more than anybody else.
So the R in your name is for Richardson, is
That's
that
right.
Okay.
That's right.
And you and your grandfather, I think, later practiced law together, I
That's
believe.
right.
Okay.
He went off the bench in 1934, and he started practicing again. And he didn't have any practice. Couldn't have if he'd been on the bench for 30 years. And I had just passed the bar exam in September the 15th, 1934. He went off the bench September the 1st. So we opened a law office together right at that time.
Okay. Tell me about your family. Tell me about your parents and any brothers and sisters, and we'll talk a little bit about your childhood as well.
Okay. Well, my father was Ellis Rucker. He was a farmer and sort of a businessman. At one time, he served as circuit court clerk in Rutherford County. Another time, he served as secretary for Congressman W.C. Houston from Woodbury. But mostly he was in the real estate and insurance business during my lifetime. And he never was involved in law. My mother was Judge Richardson's daughter, and it sounds like I'm bragging, but I'm not. But you have to realize that back in those days, there was always some prominent man in the community that everybody respected and looked to, and Judge Richardson was one of those people. And so my mother was very opinionated and very direct and very much interested in my going to law school.
Okay. Was she very much like her father then? Well, apparently he was opinionated and direct
well,
as well.
I guess I may be exaggerating that a little bit. He had his opinion. He didn't try to force it on other people, but he didn't mind letting you know what he thought. I guess that's the best way.
Okay. Well, your father was actually involved in the law to some extent, being a circuit court clerk for a period of time.
Oddly enough, I think I was 25 years old. 20 now, not 20. I was 20 years old before I knew that he'd ever been in circuit court clerk. He was a very quiet, very restrained, very retiring man. He never talked about what he did. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until after I guess I did find out he had been in Congress, because that's where he met my mother. My mother was visiting Judge W.C. Houston, who had become Congressman Houston from Woodbury, who had married my grandmother's sister. And that's where he met my father. She met my father. So families all stayed together.
That's great. Now tell me about where and when were you born?
I was born here in Murfreesboro, And we didn't have a hospital then. I was born on Lytle Street. And of course, it's November the 2nd, 1915.
Okay, and that's not far from where we're sitting. Lytle Street, of course,
Yeah, it's
is
just
downtown
about 3 blocks
Murfreesboro.
over.
Okay, and we're at the corner of Vine and Church now, so we're just a few blocks from Lytle.
And the
Lytle,
house is still there.
I was just going to ask, is the house on Lytle? It is still there.
My father sold it to the Presbyterian Church, and it was the parsonage for the Presbyterian Church for 30 odd years. I don't know who owns it now.
Can you tell me a little bit about your childhood, about your home life and your friends?
Well, I don't think I had any very eventful childhood. By the time I was a teenager, we were starting into the Depression, and I remember very vividly that I carried papers for 5 years, the Daily News Journal, carried the first one that they had, and carried on up until I graduated from high school. I was carrying newspapers 18 months before I became a lawyer. Just so happened I quit carrying newspapers in May of 1933, and I became a lawyer in September of 1934, which I thought was a little unusual.
What about your friends from childhood? Are there any of those childhood friends that are still friends or that are still alive?
No. I looked at the pictures of my graduating high school class, and there are only 2 or 3 in Murfreesboro that I can remember that are here. And those that I was close with either have moved away or have passed on.
Who was your best friend as a boy? Do you recall who that was?
A boy named Rufus Brandon. His father was superintendent of schools, and he lived 2 or 3 blocks from us. I used to go spend the night in his house. He'd come spend the night in my house.
Any particular things that you and Mr. Brandon did?
Yes, we used to sit down on the road. We'd sit down on the road, and we'd pick up little bitty stones and throw them at the cars. This would be at nighttime, sitting just after dark. Throw them at the cars so they would drop on the cars as they go by. I'm not particularly proud of that, but the story that I want to tell is that while we were doing that, one car stopped and started walking up the driveway to my house, and Rufus was with me. He and I ran down the street, ran a block away, and came in. When we came back, my dad looked at me and said, "Well, you ran off, but I know why you ran off."
Now, which grade school did you go to?
I went to what was known as East End Grammar School. It was on Main Street, no longer exists.
Okay. And then you went to high school. So after grammar school, then you went to Murfreesboro Central High School?
That's right. That's the old city county high school that was on North Maple Street, where the Middle Tennessee Electric Membership Corporation has an office now. It burned during the war and just completely destroyed. And they didn't build what we now call the old Central High School until after the war.
I see. So you were in the class of what year?
Golly, 33.
Okay. Were there any notable classmates from the high school class that...
Well, I can't, for the life of me, think of any of us that are notable. There were a number of close friends, some that I traveled with on different occasions, and some that I still see. 2 live in Nashville. There are a couple that live here in Murfreesboro that I don't see much anymore. There really were not any close friends of mine, and not anybody that I could say would be outstanding as far as trying to tell something about them.
Well, there's certainly one notable member of the class, and that's you, but...
Well, I don't know about that.
Okay.
Maybe so.
Now, after high school, this is where the story really gets, of your life, gets to be really particularly notable, and that's the fact that you went directly from high school to law school. Can you tell us how that happened?
Well, I had said I wanted to study law, and remember now that in 1933 and in 34, you could go to Cumberland on 1 year, for 1 year, and you got a cram course for taking the Tennessee bar exam. If you want to know the truth of the matter, that's what it was. And 1 year of law, you could take the bar exam, and that you didn't have to have any college training at all. So it was the middle of the Depression. The bank that my father and grandfather did business with had gone broke. We really were not poor, but we didn't have any money, and they didn't. Neither one of my parents thought that they would have enough money to send me to a 2 or 3 year law school after going maybe to MTSU for a couple of years. So they decided that I ought to take the $500 that approximately that I'd saved up and go to Cumberland and get my law degree, and then we'd see what happened after that. So that's the reason why I went to Cumberland, and that's how I happened to be getting my law degree in 1934. Again, the Depression really had a terrific influence, I think, on my generation, because those of us that can remember, I remember the day the bank closed, and my dad was in Florida fishing, and mother was at the office and didn't have enough money to buy groceries. You couldn't get any money out of the bank. And I can remember when my father had to borrow money on the house to pay for the groceries and all in 1933 and 34. So that accounts for my going to law school at such a young age.
Okay, so you went to law school for 1 year. You enrolled in 33. You were the class of 1934.
That's correct.
Okay, and that's when Cumberland was located at Lebanon, Tennessee, I believe. That's
right. Okay. And they had what they call the old law barn. I don't know whether you can go back to remember that. It's torn down now, but it was on Main Street in Lebanon and had been there since the early 1800s. I don't mean 1800, 1880s.
Okay. And you took the bar exam in the same year?
I took it in the summer of 1934. You didn't have anything to help you prepare for school, for a law exam. We had pretty intensive training. We had Judge Albert Williams, who was a circuit judge in Nashville. You may have heard of him. And he was one of the teachers. There were two judges in Nashville, Judge A.B. Neal and Judge Albert Williams, that were judges, and they would leave after they'd finished court at 1 o'clock and ride to Lebanon and teach us law. And I don't think they came every day, but they came at least 3 or 4 days a week. And Judge Williams taught civil law. He taught the history of a lawsuit. That was what he was teaching. And Judge Neal taught Chancery. He was a chancellor.
Now, at the time you passed the bar, you just got the 1 year out of high school. You were how old at that time?
Well, I was 18. I would be 19 later in 1934. But at the time, September the 15th, I was 18 years old.
Okay. So I presume that made you, I guess, about the youngest lawyer in the state of Tennessee ever.
No, I think there's somebody in Nashville who was admitted at 18, and I can't remember now who.
Jordan Stokes, I believe, was.
Was he admitted at 18?
I think that's right.
Okay, I knew there was somebody in Nashville. I don't know how close he was to 19. He may have been younger than I.
Okay.
But it was unusual. I had to go into court and have my disability of minority removed in order to be able to take the bar exam. You had to be 21 to take the bar exam. And the only way you could do that, if you had your degree, was to go into court and have the judge remove your disability of minority and let you take the bar exam.
So that's what you did? That's
what I did.
Okay. Now, did you have any brothers and sisters?
I have one brother, Ellis Rucker, Jr. He's still living. He's retired from teaching at MTSU. He was a biology teacher at MTSU for right after World War II until he retired 10, 12 years ago.
Is he younger?
He's older.
Older, okay.
He's 20 months older than I am.
Okay. Now, mentioning MTSU, I'll jump ahead a little bit. You later on went back to college, I believe.
Well, what happened was, when I started practicing law with my grandfather, I thought I had it made. And my mother and father, particularly my mother, she was pretty insistent that she didn't want one of her sons to think he had gotten a good education by simply going to law school 1 year. And she just said flat out right, you're going to register at MTSU. You can go in the morning and then you can go to the office in the afternoon and practice law, but you're going to get a degree. You're not well educated yet. So I did. I enrolled at MTSU and graduated in 1938.
Okay, so you had the distinction of being probably one of the few people that got their law degree 4 years before they got their college degree.
That's correct.
And, of course, at that time, it wasn't Middle Tennessee State University. What was it called at that time?
It was Middle Tennessee State Teachers College.
Okay. And
I have a BS degree from Middle Tennessee State Teachers College.
Okay. And have you had any association with MTSU then down through the years?
Oh, yes. I've tried to. I guess I haven't been as desirable alumni as a lot of the people in the way of making contributions to the school. I haven't had the money to do that. It just wasn't appropriate for me to use what money I had to send to college. I have helped send two of my grandchildren to MTSU. But I really have not been that involved. I like to watch the football and basketball games.
I believe you have taught there some too. As
Yes, during the summer, one of the teachers, Gene Sloan, was helping in a governor's election, and he taught business law at MTSU. I don't remember what year, it was in the early 50s, while I was General Sessions Judge. He asked me to teach 2 different summers the business law class.
And you like doing that?
No, that was not my cup of tea.
Oh, okay. Now, when you started practicing law then in 1934, I believe you said you practiced with your grandfather right off the bat, is that right?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And tell me about the law practice that you and he had. What kind of things did you do?
He didn't have any, I didn't have any. And honest, I'm not kidding. I don't think that we grossed over $500-600 for a year, because here he was starting from scratch, and the only practice he really developed was other lawyers who said, here's a retired judge that can help us try our big lawsuits. But I can tell you about my first case.
Okay, I was going to ask you about that.
Well, the first case that I had to try was before a magistrate. Now, you have to remember, we didn't have general sessions judges back then. We had magistrates who held court, and the way they got paid was on fees, and that they took care of all of the minor misdemeanors and the small civil cases. Well, I got involved over the custody of a cow. And my client claimed that the cow that was out in the field was his cow, and the other man claimed, no, the cow was his cow. And I was arguing to the magistrate, now, this man can't be sure about that's his cow because it was in the summertime, it's hot, and he was identifying the color of the cow. And I said, well, he can't do that because cows sweat and get hot, and it'll change his color. And the magistrate leaned forward and said, Mr. Rucker, cows don't sweat. I lost the case.
Okay.
That's the first case I had.
Okay. And I presume that was the first fee you collected? Do you remember that?
I don't remember. It was $10 or $15, I think. I think because I lost, the man didn't want to pay me.
Now,
but we didn't have any practice. My grandfather was called upon by other lawyers to help. And we had, there's one other case that occurred back along about that time that was a significant case that to me is important. Judge Lytle from Columbia was our chancellor. My grandfather was involved in the lawsuit over who owned part of the property, which is now where the VA hospital is in Rutherford County. And is part of really of old Rucker land way back before that. But my grandfather's portion of the heirs that claimed they own it were insisting that they had the title to the land. A lawyer from Watertown, well, his name escapes me right now, but he was representing the other group. And we'd tried a long lawsuit before Judge Lytle over which title and which group of heirs was supposed to get this land. Well, while we were doing that, the government came up in 1939 and bought the land, or condemned it, took it over, paid for it, and converted it to the VA hospital. Well, the lawsuit sat there for some time, and finally my grandfather got hold of the lawyer in Watertown and said, listen, we've been talking about this farmland being worth $6,000. That's what we've talked about. The government's paid $12,000 into court. Why don't we talk to each one of our clients and say, let's settle this thing. You take $6,000, we'll take $6,000. You get what you thought you were going to get to begin with. Well, that's the way it was settled. And Judge Lytle had taken the case under advisement. And he'd had it under advisement. And he'd had it under advisement. This was a year later. So the next time that he was here from Columbia, we went in and stood before the judge. My grandfather stood up and said, Judge, we've settled that old case. And and Judge Lytle reached and pulled in his pocket, pulled out a thing toward me. You'll never know how I decided that lawsuit. I honestly believe he was just kidding, but he may have decided it.
Now, in those early days, I presume that, as you said, a lot of people came to the office because your grandfather was a retired judge.
Yeah.
But you had grown up here, and I presume that a lot of the people of your generation started coming to you because they knew you and had at least known you as a boy or had grown up with you. Did you develop a following of your own in those early days?
I don't think I did. I don't think I did. Remember, I didn't have to. I did go to college on Cliff in 1938. My grandfather became ill in the summer of 38 and died in 1940. And what practice I had built up really came in the last couple of years before I entered the war, in World War II. And I didn't build up a practice. I just wrote deeds and checked titles and went in to the magistrate's court to represent people on minor misdemeanors and things like that. But I don't think we tried one case in Bedford County, but I just didn't have many. I didn't get much practice, that's the truth.
Before we leave this particular era, let me ask you about your classmates at Cumberland in the class of 1934. Were there any particularly notable people from that class, or some of your friends that you stayed friends with down through the years?
I got my picture off out of the dresser the other day and went down. I was 193 graduates from Cumberland.
193?
193 in that one picture. And I went down trying to see names that I could remember. Well, Robert Clements, Frank Clements' father, was in the class. He had been teaching school at Lebanon, and he gave up his teaching job and went to law school that year. Frank, I think, was a student maybe in high school in Lebanon. And he's one that I remember very well. Of course, I got to know him later in life and became sort of close to him, particularly when in the latter part of his life when Miss Annabelle and I were close friends too. Howard Butler from Nashville, General Butler as he's known. As a matter of fact, Howard borrowed $5 from me about a month before, and I didn't have $5 to lend, but he was a fraternity brother, and I had to fuss at him to pay me back. I never let Howard forget that during the years that we've been friends. Well, I had to make you pay me that $5. Joel Evans was one of the classmates. Sam Houston Johnson. Now, Sam Houston Johnson won't register with many people, but Sam Houston Johnson was a brother of our President Johnson. And we called him Old Sam Houston. And we had some correspondence and contact for a few years, but he got too far up the ladder to bother corresponding with a little old lawyer in Murfreesboro.
Did he go back to Texas? Was he?
Yeah, he went back to Texas and practiced law there. He had quite a career, you know. I don't know whether you know it or not, but he did.
You've made reference to the war, and I know that when World War II came, that you took off and went to the war. You were practicing law right up until that time?
Yes.
After your grandfather died, did you continue by yourself?
Well, I moved in an office with J.J. Jewell, Jr., who at that time was appointed district attorney, and he wanted to have a lawyer move into the office with him and this was in 1941, to move in the office with him to help take us. You remember the attorney generals back in those days could practice law the same as general sessions judges. And so I moved in the office with J.J. Jewell, Jr., and I stayed with him. What happened was I drew a very, very low draft number, and I was informed in January of 1941, and remember this is before war started for us, that I had a low number and I probably was going to have to go in February. So I wound up my law practice, what little it was, and closed up my office. And then when February, they said, well, you don't have to go. We've had enough volunteers, so it looks now like it might be April before you go. So I sat around for about a month and then went down to see the draft board, and they said, well, now it looks like it may be summer before you go. And I said, well, to heck with that. Put me on the list next time. So that's the way I went in May of 1941.
Let me digress one little bit before we leave this particular era. Your grandfather was a retired judge. Did retired judges draw a good retirement in those days, or what?
No, when he retired, there was no such thing as a judge retirement. In 1937, I think, there were 3 judges that had retired like he had in their 70s. And they had, in the meantime, passed, from 1934 to 1937, the legislature had passed a bill that provided a modest retirement for judges. And that had gone into effect. And then they found 3 judges, Judge Rutherford from Nashville, Judge Richardson from, and I've forgotten the third one's name, and a special act provided they should be entitled to draw $200 a month for the rest of their life. So, but for the first 3 or 4 years, he really was supported by one of his sons.
Do you recall any stories that he had about any of the notable cases that he had when he was on the bench in the early part of the century?
No, he liked to write poetry, and I know one that he wrote the decision that he made in the case was in poetry. It's just rhyme, that's all it was. But I can't remember his ever telling me about any particular case that he tried.
You and he were partners. I noticed you said you were an associate, I believe, of Mr. Jewell.
Jewell, yeah. Now, he and I were partners, yeah. He started off by saying, well, John, I don't know how we're going to get by. I don't know what living, but I'll take this with you. I'll pay the expenses of the office. Now, we had an office that wasn't more than about 18 by 18, had 2 desks in it, didn't have a secretary, had 1 telephone, had a restroom down the hall, and my dad was in the real estate business, was in an adjoining office. We had a coal stove that sat in his office, had to leave the door open to ours so it'd be heated. And we didn't have any expenses to amount to anything. So he said, I'll pay the expenses and give you 1/5 of whatever we make after the expenses. And some months, I didn't make anything. If I hadn't been able to live at home with my parents, they hadn't been so set on my getting a college degree, I'd have starved to death.
Do you remember what your phone number was when you first got a phone at the office?
417.
Okay. Now, when the war came, World War II, of course, broke out in December the 7th of 1941 with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Where were you in your military career?
I was at Officers'
time?
Candidate School in Georgia, Camp Fort Benning. And I had been down in Macon, Georgia, getting basic training, and I applied for and was accepted for Officers' Candidate School. I got my degree and commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant on February the 28th, 1942. So I was at Fort Benning, Georgia, sleeping on a cot in a barracks when a fella came over and shook me and said, John, the Japs have bombed Pearl Harbor. And as most people said at that time, where the hell is Pearl Harbor? I never will forget that.
What happened right after Pearl Harbor at the unit where you were? What happened in the days that followed?
I got my commission as 2nd lieutenant. I was assigned to the 90th Infantry Division at Camp Barkley at Abilene, Texas. And I was sent out there to help organize and train the 90th Infantry Division, which later was one of the divisions that went across the channel on D-Day. I didn't like it out there. I didn't like the sand that blows out there. Golly, that was terrible. They were giving us 18-hour marches, full pack. We were training raw recruits, trying to get them ready to go overseas. And I didn't like it. Well, the colonel had issued an order that nobody could apply for a transfer, because if he'd have let them apply for transfer, there wouldn't have anybody left. They would have gone out just shoo like that. They would have been gone. Well, one day I looked on a bulletin board. I said, I've got to get out of this unit. This is terrible. I don't want to be in the infantry in the first place. I had a pretty good idea that this unit would be one of those that would go, and if they ever did anything, we'd be one of the first ones. And I said, I got to get out of here. And on the bulletin board was a notice. It said, if any officer or enlisted man that has a private pilot's license can apply direct to Washington for training as a glider pilot. I'd never heard of a glider pilot, but I said, hell, that's the way to get out of here. And I sent an application in. They sent me an order in about 2 weeks after sending it in. You know, in the Army, as you well know, it would take 6 months to get anything like that done. 2 weeks, I got notice to get a physical exam at an adjoining camp. 2 weeks later, they notified me I passed the exam. 2 weeks after that, they transferred me to Hondo, Texas for glider training. And I was out in the field one day. I knew that I'd been accepted, but I didn't know where I was going. And the adjutant came up and said, the colonel wants to see you. I went in, stood before the colonel. He said, how in the hell did you get out of here, John? I said, I just filed my application. He said, well, don't you know I can court-martial you for applying for a transfer without going through channels? I said, well, Colonel, that's what I did because that's what the paper said. And the adjutant said, yeah, that's right. That's the way it is. He said, well, you get out of here. I'm using a few curse words. I have to quit saying hell, woman. He used a few curse words and said, get out of here. And that's when I left. That's how I came to be a glider pilot, because I didn't like West Texas.
So you already had a private pilot's license at that time?
Back in 1939, I think it was, the president of MTSU, or Middle Tennessee State Teachers College, Q.M. Smith, I'd gotten to know him in various ways, and I ran up on him on the street one day, and he said, John, do you want to learn to fly and get a private pilot's license? You can come out to college and enroll there, and you can get a private pilot's license. It won't cost you a penny. You don't have to pay any registration fees, anything. You just come out there, and we're going to have this class, and the government's trying to get a class started at all these universities. And I said, well, I've graduated, Dr. Smith. I can't. He said, we'll class you as our first graduate student. I said, that's fine. And that's the way I got a private pilot's license. So I've often said that if I hadn't got that private pilot's license, I probably would have been in D-Day with the 90th Infantry Division. So I was very grateful for having had a private pilot's license that got me into the glider program.
Now you went to Hondo, Texas, I believe you said, for your first glider training, is that right?
Yeah, we actually didn't do much training there. We went from one place to another. We went to Hamilton, Texas. We went to Bonita, Oklahoma. We went to Dalhart, Texas. We went to Lubbock, Texas. And it seems to me like there was another one. They sent us all over the state from one place to another.
There's an old country song, happiness is Lubbock, Texas in the rearview mirror. Did you think the same thing?
Right.
Okay.
Well, we got, the group that I was with, got our glider wings, I believe it would be March of 1943. No, it was April 15th, 1943.
Okay. And then when you got your wings, what was your next assignment?
Well, we were ferrying gliders over the United States. We'd pick them up in St. Louis. We'd pick them up in Minneapolis. They were all furniture factories producing the gliders. And we'd fly them sometime to Waco, Texas, sometimes to North Carolina, sometimes to Louisville, Kentucky, where they had some gliders. And that's what I was doing with the 96 Troop Carrier Squadron. I was in a troop carrier unit. And I also was assigned as a squadron intelligence officer. And to get right down to the point of what happened was, they told us we had to give up any administrative job to keep our glider rating. By then, I had gotten some ideas of what a glider pilot was going to do when he got in combat. Now, they had never explained that to us, but we had some instructions, and I decided, hey, this isn't near as good as I thought it was going to be. So I had an opportunity to take a job as squadron executive officer of the 96 Troop Carrier Squadron and give up my glider pilot rating, or keep my glider pilot rating and go on overseas. And I elected to give up my glider pilot rating, which was, I think, a smart deal after I saw what some of our glider pilots had to do during the war.
And what was the mission of the gliders?
Well, the gliders would fly in supplies behind the line, or on D-Day they flew in with troops. And they were not paratroopers. The paratroopers jumped from the C-47s, which were the planes of the troop carrier squadron. But the gliders went in with anywhere from 8 to 14 people in the glider, and they landed in a field and really crash landed the glider, and then they fought with the people that they brought over until such time as they could meet up with those that were coming to meet them, and then they'd go back and wait for the next mission to fly in again.
What aircraft did you use to launch the gliders?
Well, the gliders were pulled by a C-47, a DC-3, this old DC-3 that we all flew in.
The old Goonie bird.
That's right.
Okay. And so then you became the executive officer, and then what happened after that?
I stayed as executive officer until the end of the war. I really decided I wanted to get a little bit higher than first lieutenant, and I managed to go up the ladder to captain to a major.
Did you go overseas with the unit, or?
Yes, I went on overseas. I'm sorry, I didn't tell that.
Okay.
When the unit went overseas, I went over and I was responsible for managing the squadron. The squadron commander was a pilot. He did the flying of the planes, supervised the pilots. My job as executive officer was to see that all of the administrative work was properly done.
And where were you stationed overseas?
Stationed it's close to Nottingham. North, well, the name of the city escapes me at the first. Then we went over, I guess, on D plus, 30 days after. And we went to, and I was based most of the time at Orleans until the end of the war.
Okay. And when the war ended, you have any specific memories about the end of the war, about the day that it ended? And
well, I just remember we went to those camps that were named for cigarettes. It had Lucky Strike and Camel, and you went to a camp, and then you finally wound up in England, and we were getting ready to come back on the Queen Mary, and they delayed us for 4 days. And we said, what are we delayed for? I said, well, there's a strike in New York City, and we can't unload the ship without the people who are unloading. They've got a strike on, so we have to sit here and wait until they settle that strike. The only time I ever wrote and sent a wire to a congressman, Harold Earthman was our congressman from Murfreesboro, and I sent him a wire and said, for goodness sake, settle that strike so we can come home.
Now, when you got home, back to New York, any specific memories about the landing there of the Queen Mary?
That wasn't that impressive. We were all so glad to get home. We were all so glad to walk down, and I wasn't the only one that saw knelt down and patted the ground when I got on it. There was a lot of that. We were really glad to be back. It took about 3 days for them to process me. And terminal leave, that's what I want to say. My terminal leave expired on February the 4th, 1946. And that was almost 5 years that I'd been in the service.
Were there any friends from your days in the Army Air Corps that you have kept up with down through the years, the people you served with in Europe or in Texas or any of the other places?
Well, there was one, Jeb McKinney, who was responsible for my meeting my wife. You don't want to hear that story.
I certainly do.
You do? Okay, if you want to hear it. When we were stationed at Alliance, Nebraska, this friend of mine, Jeb McKinney's girlfriend, came over to spend Christmas with him. On New Year's Eve, we had a party at the Officers Club, and his wife-to-be, Lyle said, John, why aren't you married? And I said, I've never found the right girl. She said, I'm going to make it a point of mine. I'm going to find you the right girl so that you find the right person to marry. I said, that's fine, Lyle. You let me know when you found her. Well, I went on overseas. Lyle and Jeb married and went to Houston, Texas. While they were in Houston, Texas, they met my wife, Betty Wolf. She was an executive secretary of a big company down there. And is just meeting with different people and all, and got to know Betty, and both of them liked her. And they told Betty, they said, now Betty, we've picked out the man for you to marry. When you get, this war's over and he comes back, we're going to bring him down here to meet you. And So when Jeb came overseas, he was taking navigation training. He didn't go with us. He got transferred into our unit, and he and I used to sit and play gin rummy by the hour. We just played. Didn't have anything to do. I didn't like to gamble. And he didn't either, and that's about all most of them did when they didn't have anything to do. So one night we were playing, and I expect we'd had a couple of drinks, and he said, "John, I just remembered, we picked out the girl for you to marry in Texas." I said, "What do you mean?" And he went through the explanation. He said, "Why don't you write a letter?" I said, "You write a letter, I'll write a letter." He wrote the letter, I wrote a letter, Betty wrote the letter. At the end of the war, I got on a plane. We wrote for 11 months. I got on a plane, flew to Texas, asked her to marry me. She came up and spent 5 days with me and my family at Christmas, and we married on January the 28th. We'd been together 9 days when we married. And my wife, Betty, often said, if one of my children ever does anything foolish like that, I'll shoot him.
So you all have been married now how many years?
Well, 46, 54 years.
Okay. And so you truly had a pen pal romance
right.
by mail.
I had, of course, my friend said, when we came back to Murfreesboro here, Betty and I came up here and I started practicing law. And they said, "Where'd you meet Betty?" I said, "That's too long a story. I can't tell you that."
Now, when you got back to Murfreesboro, you went back into the practice of
That's
law
right.
immediately?
I went back in an association with Mr. Jewell.
Okay, and how long did that association continue?
Well, it really lasted until we separated in 1980. Of course, it was an association. Now, we never were partners. He operated his business, but we shared offices, we shared the secretary, we shared books, we shared other expenses. But we were on opposite sides of lawsuits a few times.
Now, you've alluded to your children. Tell me about your children, and we'll switch back to the law practice in a few minutes. But I wanted to ask you about your children at this point.
Well, I have 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. The oldest one is Richard. He's a lawyer here in Murfreesboro. But the youngest child is John Richardson Rucker Jr., who's also a lawyer. They are in partnership and have been. Richard joined me in the practice of law in 1970. John joined Richard and me in the practice of law in 78, I believe. And they now operate the office, and I haven't been active in the practice for 10 or 15 years. But then, oh, wait a minute, that's just my sons. I was really thinking about law. I've got 2 lovely daughters, Libby, who's Assistant Emergency Management Director for Rutherford County. She has 2 children. And carrying on the military tradition, my grandson, her oldest son, Todd Reed Jr., is a captain in the United States Special Forces stationed in Okinawa. He made up his mind he wanted to go into the military in college, and got his degree, commissioned 2nd lieutenant. He's been out about 7 years now. And he's got a unit over there composed of 8, 10 people that's trained to go anywhere, anytime, any place, do anything. So he's keeping the military going.
And you're quite proud of it.
I sure am.
Okay.
I sure am. And then the other daughter, I get wrapped up in one, is my youngest daughter, Debbie. She's married to Jeff Combos in Franklin. He's a lawyer, so we got lawyers there. But I can't seem to get any of my grandchildren interested in law. Debbie is a school teacher, was. She's now taking care of her 2 children.
And what are their ages?
Well, the youngest one is 9, and the oldest one of Debbie's is 13.
Any great-grandchildren?
Yes, I must tell you about the great-grand. That's the big point in the family. The Todd and his wife, Karen, in Okinawa, she gave birth to a little girl, Jordan. They named her Jordan, on Libby's birthday, November the 18th of last year, and she's going to be here in 2 weeks. They're coming over, and they're going to stop in California, and they're going to stop and visit us, and then go. And she and Karen and Jordan are coming here. Of course, Todd can't come, but they're coming. So I'm going to in addition to seeing her on the internet, I'm going to get to hold her this next 2 weeks from now.
Great.
Jordan, Kaylee, Reed. I'm good to be able to remember those names.
Now, you said Richard joined you in 1970, and you all formed a law firm at that time.
That's right.
I presume you called it Rucker and Rucker.
Rucker and Rucker.
Okay.
And it's still Rucker and Rucker.
Okay. And then John Jr., or Jock as most people call him, came in 77.
In 77.
Okay.
He went to Memphis. Dick went to UT. He went to Memphis Law School.
Any particularly noteworthy cases that you've worked on with your sons?
Well, yes, I was defending a murder case. A man by the name was, well, I guess I better not remember. I'm not sure. Swayze, I believe, was his name. On the 4th of July, he had a carload of kids that he went to his house and had an argument with this man, and they had been celebrating the 4th of July. And to make the long story short, he came back and the man pulled a gun on him, and he reached down in the floorboard of his car and pulled up a rifle and shot the man and killed him. And I represented him, defended him. And I thought I had a real good case. I really thought I had, and I did, as it turned out. But the question was whether my client had pulled the gun out first or whether the other one that was killed had pulled his pistol first. And there was a lady in this, this was a dilapidated old house out in the country. And this group had gotten together on the 4th of July, as they would like to do, and to have a party, and they'd all been drinking, I'm sure. And this woman standing on the front porch was the prime witness of the Attorney General that my man had gotten the rifle out because she saw him with the rifle before the other man pulled his pistol. I went out and looked and found that she couldn't have, because the other man was halfway back in the yard by the side of the house, and if she was on the front porch, she could not have seen him. So I took a picture of it, a great big picture, had a professional come out and take the picture, and had it big, framed and all. So when she got on the witness stand, I said, "Wherever you stand." So I stand right in the doorway. "Well, could you see my client?" She said, "Yes, I saw him get that rifle." "Well, how do you know whether or not the guy that was killed pulled the pistol?" "Well, I saw him. I saw him. He didn't pull the pistol until after that rifle was out." And then I got the picture up and said, "Now show me where you were standing." She said, "Right there." And obviously she couldn't see it. And as a result of that, my client was acquitted. And I kept that picture, it was a very big framed picture, and hung it on the wall. And it was a great sport for me to have it in my office, and people would come in and say, "John, what's that picture of?" I go, "That's my old home face."
Now, I believe after the war you also served as General Sessions judge for a number of years.
For 12 years,
And
1948 to 1962.
tell me about how that came about. How did you wind up running for General Sessions judge? Were you appointed, or you run, or how did it?
The gentleman who had been appointed, see, they created the General Sessions judge in 1946. Jack Todd, who was named in the legend, they named him in the bill that created it, served 12, I start to say 12 days, I think 12 weeks, and resigned. He didn't like it. And another man was appointed, and he was a fine lawyer. He knew how to check titles and write deeds and wills, but he had never tried a lawsuit and never been connected with, in any way, with the trial and the tribulations of people who have difficulty living together. And that's a lot of what General Sessions judges did back then. And he wasn't very popular. And I'd been back, almost 2 years, 1948, he had to run for re-election. And I ran and beat him. And the reason I did was because at that day and time, if you were the only soldier, the only veteran in any race, you won. You didn't have to do anything, you won. The veterans stuck together and elected. And that's the way I happened to be judge, and then I stayed in until 1962 when I resigned. But I was allowed to practice law.
I was going to say it was a part-time position, was it
Yes.
not?
You know, I'd go over at 9 o'clock and I might have 2 cases. And by 10 o'clock, I'd be back in my office. And if I had one that took a couple hours to try, I was through by noon. But of course, they didn't pay you much. They paid me $300 a month, big sum. $3,600 a year.
And no office expenses or secretary, anything like that?
Didn't furnish you anything.
Okay. Any particularly noteworthy case that you tried as a General Sessions judge?
Well, right at the moment, I'm not.
Well, let me ask you about one. I did some research, of course, in preparing for this. I talked to a couple of your friends here,
Okay.
Whitney Stegall, retired chancellor, and Dick LaRoche, who is still practicing law, who himself was a judge for a time, and two of your closest friends I know, as well as I interviewed your son Jock and talked with him about this upcoming interview.
I hope they didn't tell it all.
Well, they didn't tell it all, I'm sure, but they told me a lot of interesting anecdotes. And the one that Dick LaRoche mentioned was the fact that he had a case one time involving two funeral homes over the who got the possession of a corpse that you had. You recall that case?
You know, that's been so long ago. I know what you have reference to, but for the life of me, I don't remember. I can't. If you ask me how was the case decided, Dick may have told you that, but I don't remember what my involvement was.
Well, he told the story that this man had his burial insurance, he belonged to the Burial Association with a particular funeral home, and the relatives sent him to the other funeral home after he died, and the funeral home that had the Burial Association wanted the corpse because they wanted that business. And since the body was taken to the other funeral home, Dick LaRoche represented the one who wanted it, the one that had the Burial Association, and he said they filed a lawsuit in the court over which you presided in General Sessions Court to replevy a replevin warrant.
Replevy the body. It comes to me now. I had forgotten all about that.
And he said that you had the big issue was how much bond did they have to make. Do you remember how you calculated the bond?
No, I don't have that. I just remember now the circumstances.
And
what did I do?
Well, according to the way Mr. LaRoche tells the story is that you was trying to decide how much the bond ought to be, and somewhere somebody had published recently before that time how much a corpse was worth, how much the various mineral elements and the various parts of the corpse would be worth if they were sold on the open market. And you had read that article, and the results of that article was the amount that you set for the bond. And so they made their bond, replevied the body, and had the funeral, and of course the case was completed.
I remember that now, but I had forgotten. That's one that just had slipped my mind.
Any other cases that come to mind from your days as General Sessions judge?
Well,
any particular criminal cases or civil cases?
Well, we of course, the General Sessions judges, you remember, could only had such limited jurisdiction, and when we first started, it's a lot more limited. Was a lot more limited then than it is now, and I don't remember any eventful. There were a number of preliminary hearings on murder cases that I conducted, and I remember making sure that we had police officers. A lot of times I'd go over the whole court, and I'd go into the big courtroom with the circuit judge, and he'd be out not holding court that day, and I'd sit in there, and I didn't even have an officer to wait on the court. And I was lucky if I could get the clerk to come in and bring some papers to me. That's the truth. And I'd have to find the papers and call them out. And then if it was a criminal case, of course, the sheriff was always there. But a lot of times there weren't but the sheriff and 4 deputies in Rutherford County at that time when we started. They were out busy. They couldn't come up and bother to be in little old General Sessions Court. And I sometimes had to just really conduct the case, prosecute it, defend it, and then make a decision.
How big a staff did the district attorney have at that time?
He didn't have any staff.
So he was doing it all by himself?
He was doing it by himself.
How many counties did he cover?
He had 4. He had Rutherford County, Bedford, and Marshall. The judge had Rutherford County, Bedford, and Marshall.
And so, you mean one man and one judge covered that entire area?
One man, yes, sir.
Let me ask you about how you ended your General Sessions tenure. Did you
Well,
just get tired and quit, or what? How'd that end?
I decided that I wasn't going to make any money practicing law as long as a lot of people looked at me as a general sessions judge. They didn't know that I could practice law. So friends that would have employed me and people didn't because they thought I was judge. And of course, from 1948 to 1962, the job had increased tremendously in its responsibilities. And they had increased the salary, I think, to $6,000. I think I was making $6,000 in '62. And I could see that I'd just be sitting there, and eventually it would just be a full-time job. So I decided that I was not going to continue. And the sheriff at that time, Bill Wilson, told me one day, he said, "John, why don't you just quit?" We were riding going somewhere, and I said, "Golly, I can't give up that $6,000. My practice is pretty good now." He said, "You'll never make any money practicing law if you don't give up that judgeship." And taking his advice, I quit, and sure enough, that's when my practice really began to amount to something. Up until then, I had a very limited practice.
So then it was about, let's see, 62, and your older son came to be with you in 70, so you had about 8 years of
I had four children pretty close together. One was born in 47, one was born in 49, one was born in 50, one was born in 53. And I could see college coming up in 1965, and in 1967 a second one, and in 1968 a third one, and then in 1971 a fourth one. And I knew I couldn't do that with the type of practice I had, so that's the reason I went into the practice, was because I knew I had to, and my practice did. One significant thing was I was appointed to try and prosecute all of the condemnation cases in Rutherford County on I-24. I also was trying all of the condemnation cases on Federal Highway 70 in Cannon County, Federal Highway 56 in Cannon County, and State Highway 96 in Rutherford County. And over a period of about 6 or 7 years, beginning in, I'd say, 1966, and extending until 1972 or 3, I must have tried, I never really totaled them up, but I'm sure I filed over 150 condemnation cases. And back in those days, nobody accepted what the state paid. Everybody went to trial. And you'd have a section of I-24 where there'd be 30 or 40 pieces of property being condemned, and you'd have 35, 36 condemnation cases. Nobody would take what the state paid. So I had to try them. They wouldn't settle them. And that's where I really got my experience trying lawsuits. And if I acquired any knowledge and good experience, it was trying those. In the meantime, I was being employed as a defense counsel for insurance companies, and I developed a defense practice.
I think we've reached a natural stopping place. Let's take a short break, and we'll come back and pick up with your career in about 1962 and the years that followed. Senator Rucker, in those years that you served here in Rutherford County and General Sessions Court and some other positions we're going to talk about later, were there any of the notable political figures that you remember that you have fond memories of or stories about?
Mr. Jim Cummins. He was a lawyer from Cannon County, Woodbury. He was a state senator when it was Cannon County's term to have a state senator, and he was a state representative when he wasn't senator. And he served, I think, some 35, 37 years. But he was very well known. He was a not too tall fella, but not fat, but he had a round face and smiled all the time, laughed, and he talked real rapidly. He'd say, now, Mr. What do you think about it? Are you going to get this all done? We're about to get that done now. And anybody that's ever known Mr. Jim Cummins knows that's the way he talked, and it was very difficult to understand him. He'd come into court and represent anybody. Well, in Cannon County, they were remodeling and redoing Highway 70 toward McMinnville. And Mr. Jim had a piece of property on that highway, and they took part of his property and filed a condemnation case because he wouldn't agree. Didn't anybody agree really back in those days? So I got ready to try it. And Mr. Jim now, by then, he was way up in ages, and this would have been in 1967 or 68, along in there. So he said, "Now, John, I'm not going to try this case. Of course, it's my case and my lawsuit. I can't try it, but I'm going to turn it over to John Melton. Let John Melton try this case for me." So he sat there, and we started trying it before the judge in Woodbury. And the first thing I did, I said, "Now, how many members of the jury here know Mr. Jim Cummins, the defendant in this case?" Every one of them held up their hand. "Well, now, how many of you have been represented by Mr. Jim Cummins?" 6 of them held up their hand. I said to myself, "Boy, I've had it." No way I can do anything. So what happened was, we got in the middle of the lawsuit, and John Melton was asking the questions not to the satisfaction of Mr. Jim, and he couldn't stand it. He just stood it as long as he could, and he just suddenly interrupted John and started cross-examining the witnesses, and he tried the case for the rest. He didn't argue it, but he finished trying the case. And do you know the jury brought in a few $100 less than he asked for? He never let me forget that I beat him in the county. I didn't beat him, they just knew he was asking for too much.
Did you ever have any other dealings with Mr. Jim Cummins, who was very, very well known around the state of Tennessee?
Well, I didn't have personally, but he appeared before me in General Sessions Court for a long time. Now, he had appeared before my grandfather as a judge, and he used to always try to compliment me. I don't try, he would compliment me. He'd say, "Now, you've got to be a judge like your grandfather was. He's the greatest judge we ever had around here." And he talked real fast like that. He goes, "Don't just forget, John, now you just be like your grandfather was." He was really an interesting man, very, very interesting.
You said something about he was a senator when it was his turn, and representative. What does that mean?
Back in those days, in the 20s and the 30s, the state senators were 2 years, and representatives were 2 years. And we had a rotation agreement here in a district, Rutherford, DeKalb, and Cannon. And we would elect the state senator from Rutherford County this year. Then next year, 2 years later, we'd elect the state senator from DeKalb County. Then 2 years later, Cannon County, and then back to Rutherford County. Then we'd start another rotation. And that way we just kept it rotating around. So when they got to Cannon County's time, he was always state senator. Well, that would make him, about 6 years in there, he wasn't in, so he would run for the representatives. And for, I think, 37 years, he was elected continuously without ever missing. He'd run for the House, Cannon County, when it wasn't Senate time. When it was Senate time, he'd go to the Senate. And I know he was Speaker of the House. I don't think he was ever Speaker of the Senate. But he was a very, very unusual man.
And I think you said he was close to the various governors. And
oh, he knew all the governors. There was, Jerry, there were 3 men that were known as the 3. At one time, I haven't thought about this. One time I could have told you who the other 2 were. One was from a little bit further east, maybe up in Putnam County. Beasley? No.
I.P. Beasley.
What?
I.P. Beasley.
I.P. Beasley, that's right. That was the 2 of them. And what was the 3rd? Maybe you remember who the 3rd one was.
Don't recall.
And they played pranks. Man, they'd play any kind of a prank. And the 3 of them were known for doing that. They would just really do it.
Now, you were telling about your case against Mr. Cummins in the condemnation case. Did you have any notable criminal cases that you tried over those years?
Well, when I first came back from the war in 1946, I went into the office with Mr. Jewell. I didn't have any law practice. I hadn't been here but 2 or 3 months. Betty and I married on the 28th of January, and I started practicing law on the 29th. Well, maybe it's the 30th for that, but excuse me. I just didn't have any law practice. And one day, a young man came into the office to Miss Jewell and said, I'm the twin brother of this man that was killed by Albert DuBois. Mr. Jewell, now you understand, was Attorney General, charged, of course, with prosecuting. And Mr. Jewell and we shared offices at a reception room. I could hear what was going on. He said, I want somebody to represent me in that. He was a twin brother of the boy that was killed. And Mr. Jewell said, well, I'll take care of the prosecution. You don't have to have a lawyer, but I want a lawyer representing me to be sure. So Mr. Jewell said, well, why don't you go talk to that lawyer across the hall there? So he came over into my office and sat down and started talking with me and told me who he was and what he wanted. He said, I just want to make sure that I've got somebody I can talk to and see that he's prosecuted. And I said, well, if you want me to do it, I'd be happy to do it. He says, well, I haven't got but $100. And I said, okay, I'll take it for $100. And I did represent. Now, Albert DuBois had already killed one person in the penitentiary. Was really a bad character here. He had thought this, the man that he killed, and for the life of me, I can't remember his name. It might come to me. But he thought that he had reported DuBois one time that had resulted in him getting caught being drunk and put in jail. And then he'd said something bad about his wife. So he sat in the barber shop and had his hair cut with two other friends, and one of them said, okay, DuBois, let's go get him. If you want to get him, let's go get him. And they said, all right, and the proof showed that the three of them walked out, and that Bantam, that was his name, B-A-N, Bantam, they called him, Bantam DuBois. He walked in the place where this man was taxi cab stand and pulled out a knife and stabbed him and killed him. And that's what we were trying, the DuBois case. The DuBois case resulted in a first-degree murder conviction and sentenced to electric chair. And he eventually did die in the electric chair after a couple of years. But it didn't take but a couple of years of appeals until he was electrocuted. And that's the last person that was electrocuted from Rutherford County. I don't think there's been anybody that's even received the electric chair as a punishment since then.
And so
but I thought I had really gotten into a real case for $100. And it did. It gave me some publicity, because the courthouse was filled every day. Every day. And we tried it on into the night. Boy, they were just God's people that they. I got a lot of good exposure in that case.
Who was the circuit judge in those days?
Judge Wiseman, John D. Wiseman.
Now, after you had served as General Sessions judge, and before we took our break, we talked about what we're going to move into next, and that's, you went to the city council, I believe, the city of Murfreesboro.
You know, I look back on it and find it strange. I was elected to the city council before I resigned as General Sessions judge. You know, we say that's strange. A judge can't be elected to another office, but we still were treating General Sessions judges as just like they were magistrates. They hadn't acquired anywhere near the stature that a General Sessions judge has today. So I was still a General Sessions judge and was elected to the to the city council, which nobody thought that was unusual.
Now, you served on the city council for how long?
City council for 6 years.
And that would be 62?
62 to 68.
Okay. And what was going on in Murfreesboro at that time?
Well,
obviously, it was a lot smaller than it is now.
We were doing a lot of seeking new industry. We had gotten some new industry during the 50s. We had gotten General Electric, we had gotten Chromalox, and we had gotten Samsonite, and we had gotten Singer, and we had gotten, and we were still in the throes in the mid-60s of trying to get new industry in here. And we were trying to do what really Murfreesboro is faced with right now, trying to absorb the people that had moved into Murfreesboro with the new industry that we'd gotten over the last 10 years. And we were faced with new subdivisions and an increased population and another road, and particularly schools. During that period, we were faced with integrating the Murfreesboro City schools, which up until that time were segregated.
Now, in those days of segregation and moving to integration, there was a lot of turmoil in a lot of parts of the state. What about Murfreesboro?
We never had it. We had a man by the name of, golly, he was a black man. It'll come to me in a minute. He's a prominent undertaker here in Murfreesboro. For the life of me, I can't remember his name. But anyway, he was on the city council. He was the first black man elected to the city council. And he was elected in '64 and served on up until just a few years ago.
And so...
But he kept things quiet.
I was going to say, he had a salutary effect on the...
That's right. He was just an outstanding man. And he kept the people who were agitating for to stop segregation and unify the schools and all. We had a black school called Holloway High School, and we integrated, and the city schools integrated, and the county schools integrated, and we didn't have any problems. I don't mean there weren't sometimes, but not any real problems.
But you had nothing like Clinton, Tennessee, or anything in Little Rock, or anything of that nature. Okay.
You remember Joe Henry going to Clinton, Tennessee?
Oh, absolutely, yes. What about, you went to the state senate then, I believe, several years later.
Yeah.
What year was that?
That was I ran in '76, took office in January of '77.
Now, so there was a hiatus period then from 1968 to 1976 that you were not involved in politics at all?
Right.
What did you do during that time?
I was trying to get my sons going at the practice of law. My wife and I had started to do a little traveling. I guess we did that a little bit later. I was getting those 4 kids through college. 3 of them went on and graduated and took graduate degrees, and one of them went 3 years and didn't graduate, got married. It took all of my time to try lawsuits and trying to help John and Richard learn how to practice and what to do and take care. I really was looking forward to the time thinking about running for the Senate or something like that and not having to spend so much time practicing. And fortunately, it worked for me. It made it possible for me to give up a lot of the practice and turn it over to them and then move into the Senate.
Now, during that time that you all were so busy practicing law, what did you do predominantly? What does your firm do predominantly?
We were predominantly defense lawyers. We represented half a dozen insurance companies. And occasionally we'd get a good damage case, which would give you a plaintiff's fee to see you through the year while you starved with the insurance companies.
Okay. Now,
I enjoyed it. State Farm has been a real fine client of ours. Of course, they have a lot of people who not only have State Farm insurance, but who work for State Farm, so they make that many more people here.
I was going to make that point. State Farm has an office here in Murfreesboro. Yeah. How long has that office been here, you recall?
It came in about 1956.
And?
54, 55 maybe.
And did you start representing them shortly after they came?
No, you see, I was General Sessions judge.
Right.
And it wasn't until, that was one of the things I guess I should have pointed out. When I resigned as General Sessions judge, my secretary was Arlene Cox, who was the wife of one of the executives at State Farm. And the lawyer who had represented State Farm became, Wiley Holloway, became Attorney General and then Circuit Judge. So State Farm was looking for a new lawyer here. And because Arlene was working for me and I knew the executive there, of course I knew others too, but I think that's what resulted in State Farm employing me to represent them. And that had a tremendous influence on my practice because, you know, if you're listed in the book as representing State Farm and some other insurance company is looking in the book to find out who they ought to get to represent them here, and they see State Farm has John Rucker, then, well, let's get John Rucker. Then if State Farm's got him, he's a good lawyer. That's was and is their reputation. So that's what built up my defense work.
Any notable plaintiff's cases that you remember that you worked on?
No, I can't. They may have told you of one, but right at the moment I can't think of one.
Okay. What about any notable defense cases? Any terribly tragic automobile wrecks that you worked on?
It was pretty routine. I really don't remember any significant cases. I did try one case with Jock, and he remembered it and reminded me of it the other day, that it was a young man on a motorcycle turned in front of our client and was struck, and they wanted, golly, I think $200,000, and this was in it would have to have been in 78 or 9, something like that, and $200,000 was an awful lot of money. Now nowadays, $200,000 in a judgment for automobile damage is not as big as it used to be, but it was tremendous. And we tried the case and won the case, kept them from getting in. In fact, I think we offered $80,000 in settlement. They wouldn't take it. I had forgotten about that case till Jock reminded me of it the other day. Now, I didn't have significant cases. I did what I have felt was an ordinary practice as a defense lawyer, and as you well know, a defense lawyer doesn't make a lot of money. Some of the big lawyers and big firms in the big cities make a lot of money out of it, but in a small town like Murfreesboro, of course, we're no longer a small town. It's getting to be a pretty big town. But you didn't make money. I just made a modest amount of money as a lawyer.
And the insurance companies, I think, kind of control the fees, too. They tell you
Well,
what
they
they'll
tell
pay.
you. They won't let you get it. Right now, of course, to my much disgust, we've gotten to the point where everybody goes on an hourly term basis, hourly cost basis now, and you fix your fees based on how many hours you spend on it. Well, a good lawyer who wins lawsuits doesn't get paid for winning a good lawsuit. He gets paid just as much if he's on defense at so much an hour, whether he wins or loses, which is a terrible situation, in my opinion.
Now, turning back to your running for the state senate, let me preface that with another question, and that is, what in your life that you can lay your finger on made you have an interest in public service and politics? Any particular event or any particular person, your grandfather, or just...
I think it goes back to my grandfather. His father, Dr. John W. Richardson, who lived in the 1840s and 50s and 60s. His name was John Watkins Richardson, and he was a politician. He ran not only for the Senate, but for the House. And my grandfather was always proud of what his father had done, and I was very well aware of his activities. And I guess the reason that I really wanted to run was we had a very fine gentleman be our state senator for so long and didn't live in Rutherford County and lived in another county, and he just managed to get reelected and reelected and reelected. And when he finally got, I think, 72, 74 years old, I had a pretty good idea he was not going to run for re-election. And I thought, I'd always had an ambition to go on in politics. I used to be very active in all sorts of politics during the 50s. I supported different people for governor and was active in their campaign. And I'll tell you the story about introducing Tip Taylor in Jackson, Tennessee. Let me tell you that one. That one is one that
This is when Tip Taylor was running for governor?
When he ran for governor, he was going to have his announcement in Jackson, Tennessee, and they invited me to come make the introduction. Now, I'd known Tip for years. He'd married a friend of mine from Lebanon, and we'd been close friends. He was judge down there, and I was flattered that I should be invited to come Jackson and introduce him in his first speech. Well, I didn't have any idea what sort of crowd would be there. And they got there, and in the courthouse yard, they had a stadium built up, and they claimed they had 5,000 people, but I really thought it was closer to 1,000 or 2,000 people. And so I got up, and I was very eloquent about introducing Tip, and I thought I'd made a wonderful speech, and everything was fine, and I was trying to figure some way to end it up. And I said, instead of all, not instead, in addition to all of these things that I've told you about Tip, he's a fine Southern gentleman. Well, with that whole crowd stood up and shouted. Have you ever seen 2,000 or 3,000 people stand up and start shouting at one time? Betty said I almost fell off the stage. But it was the biggest shock of my life to hear that swell and that talk from just my saying he was a fine Southern gentleman. And that's part of the things that I did that I enjoyed and got me interested in politics and kept me interested, and that's the reason I ran. That's not the reason. That's part of the activities that motivated me to want to run for the Senate. And I was fortunate to realize that it was the right time that our senator did not run for re-election, and I managed to win Rutherford, Bedford, Cannon, Lincoln, and Moore counties. And that started me in the Senate.
In those days, of course, everybody was a Democrat. Now,
That's right.
And you were too, of course.
Yeah, oh yes. Yeah, we didn't have any Republicans in Rutherford County. A few, postmaster and somebody like that.
Okay.
That's true. We didn't have them. Of course, we have them now, but we didn't have them back then.
What legislation that you sponsored, and I know you sponsored a number of different important pieces of legislation, which legislation would you say was the one of which you're the most proud?
Well, there are probably two as far as legal are concerned. One is the creation of the Court of the Judiciary, and the other was the Judicial Redistricting Bill of 1984. And that was the first time we really got all of our judicial districts properly located with the judges sitting with one another. Now, for those people who are in the big cities where you have 8, 10, 12 judges, some of them chancellors, some of them, they don't really interchange like they do in the districts outside of the big cities. And here we now have 4 judges, and we only had 2 back then. Well, I guess we got 5 now. Forgot we had a new one. And they interchange. They just hear anything. But that was the result of the Judicial Reform Act of 1984. And we had a hard time passing that. Did Whitney tell you the story about my threatening to withdraw it? I thought maybe you might have talked to Whitney Stegall.
I talked to him, but I don't remember that part
well,
of it.
Whitney had been state senator back in the 60s. And he was very pleased that I was running because I'd been his manager and had lost for him twice. He said, well, if you lose for me twice, maybe you lose for yourself once. But Whitney is and was one of my closest friends. I had introduced this bill. We had it all set, ready to go. Carl Kohler from Maryville said, we were not going to let it pass. We won't let it pass. The Republicans will stay together. Those of us in East Tennessee are not going because I've got to have this judge. He's got to keep this county, and he never goes to this county, just this county. I won't bother the details of which counties. Ernest Crouch in McMinnville said, I've got to have a judge go to Coffee County and McMinnville and Warren County, and I can't support it unless you're there. And I got afraid I wasn't going to get enough votes to pass it. We worked awfully hard. The judges had worked. We'd had to fight with the clerks of the circuit and chancery court. They all didn't want this redistricting because it was going to mean that judges, instead of passing one another on the road, going back and forth, chancellor would leave one county and go to another county to hold court, and the circuit judge would leave this county and go to that county instead of staying in their own counties and just hearing the cases. And the clerks didn't like it at all, and I thought we were just about to lose it. And I finally realized that I was going to have to give in to Carl. I was going to have to give in to Ernest Crouch. and I was going to have to give in to Riley Darnell. He wanted to protect his brother over in Montgomery County. Yeah, I say protect. He wanted to leave him where he was, and I just didn't have enough votes. So I called the office from Nashville and said, I don't know whether it's Jock or Dick, I'm getting ready to withdraw this bill. I was a prime sponsor and the first sponsor on it. So that put me in charge. I could dismiss the bill, wipe it out, because I was the first name on the bill. Now, a lot of other people had worked on it, but I was the first one. And I said, I'm going to withdraw it. I'm not going to let them mess this bill up. And they got together and called Whitney and came down to see me and persuaded me not to do that. Otherwise, that bill might never have passed. It would have passed some other time. So Whitney, and I always said that Whitney and Jock and Dick deserve credit for having passed that bill. We made the exceptions, and eventually they've all ironed themselves out.
Okay, so some of the exceptions did get written in the way they wanted them. Is that what happened?
That's right.
To make it go?
That's what had to happen.
It's a process of compromise, of course, in the legislature, and getting horse swapping and swapping votes. So I presume that's how you got that finally done.
We had to give in a lot. Memphis wanted 2 or 3 judges, and we finally new judges. We finally compromised, I think, on one. I don't believe we had any trouble with Knox County, and I don't believe we had any trouble with Nashville.
Now, you said you had a problem with the clerks. I presume the biggest problem would be with the clerks and masters who were appointed by the chancellors. That's
right.
As opposed to the circuit court clerks.
That's right. And the circuit court clerks were just said, oh, we can't have these chancellors coming over here trying cases, and we have to keep the minutes for them. And how are we going to keep minutes for a chancellor sitting in circuit court? We couldn't explain to them that wasn't complicated. It was relatively easy.
Now, you mentioned the creation of the Court of Judiciary. Would you explain what the Court of Judiciary is?
Well, the Court of the Judiciary,
for people who may not know what it is.
The Court of the Judiciary is a group of men who've been appointed for that job that will try any complaints against judges. I think that's the simplest way. If somebody files a complaint against a judge, and makes it formal, it's investigated by a representative of the Court of the Judiciary. Different lawyers and different judges and all do the investigation and find out whether it's really a complaint or not, and try to work something out if they can. If they can't, then it goes on and goes through and finally winds up before people who are appointed to the Court of the Judiciary, and they decide whether or not it's a severe enough case, if it is severe enough, whether or not the judge should be impeached, or whether they can issue some sort of less severe punishment. And I guess it's really not considered punishment, although I guess it is. It's to condemn them for what they've done and point out the error of their ways. And personally, I think it's one of the best things that I ever did. I think we needed in the rural areas to have some way to talk to some of these judges who would just say, well, that's the way it's going to be. And it didn't make any difference whether the lawyers liked it, whether it was the right or the wrong thing to do, whether it was good or bad. He was judge for 8 years, and you and I know of some like that, and some that have been prosecuted, and some that have been removed from office. And I feel that the Court of the Judiciary is really a fine addition. Shall I tell how it was drawn?
Surely, if you'd like.
Well, Joe Henry was on the Supreme Court, and Joe Henry is a lawyer from Pulaski, very prominent. He'd been active in the legislature, active as a lawyer, and active as in the National Guard, and was just active everywhere. And he and I had gone to college together at MTSU, and were real good friends. And his wife and Betty were good friends. It was real close relations. Joe came to me one day and said, John, I want to draft a bill called the Court of the Judiciary, and making a shorter story. I said, okay, I'll sponsor it. And I tried to draft one and couldn't. And finally, he drafted one and wrote it out in his own handwriting. And he brought it to my office down there in Nashville. and came in and shut the door. And he said, now, I have drafted the bill for the Court of Judiciary. You look at it. If you want to change it, we'll talk about it. But you look at it, and if you like it, and we'll introduce it, take it home, copy it on paper in your handwriting, bring it back. I don't want your Secretary Sandy to know that I've drafted this bill. Because if it's known by the people around here that I drafted that bill, it'll never pass. And so Joe gave me that paper. I took it home, copied it in my own handwriting, gave it to Sandy, told her to type it up, introduced it. Eventually it passed, and it was a number of years before I ever told anybody who really drafted that bill.
Now, I knew about you before I ever moved to Murfreesboro and before I ever met you, and my knowing you was through the media, and I was an admirer of yours about one particular characteristic that you had, and it was written up some in the Tennessean, and I know a lot in the Nashville Banner, and that was about your reputation as being a watchdog of the Treasury, of the state Treasury. You were very careful about making sure that money wasn't spent foolishly to the greatest extent that you could control that. Yeah, you took some really hard stands about wasteful things the state was doing with state dollars and that sort of thing. Any particular comments about that? I remember seeing your picture in the Banner one time where you were hammering some legislators about their wasting of state money on some kind of project that you thought was.
You know, really, there were so many. I don't know that I can pick out any one particular one. I was never on the Finance, Ways and Means Committee, which was the committee that really had the control.
I guess that's why they didn't put you on there. They were afraid you.
And that was the reason why the Banner would write me up, because I would try to find a way, and would find a way sometimes, to be able to discuss what the Finance, Ways and Means Committee was trying to decide what to do. And I, not being able to be on the committee, would try to take an opportunity where the Banner would pick it up and carry it on to do it. I guess that's what you have reference to.
Right. Now, you alluded to the fact that Joe Henry had been involved in a number of things. He was the Adjutant General of the state of Tennessee for a period of time.
Yes.
And I know you had a long history with the Air Force Reserve after you left active duty. Could you tell us a little bit about your days in the Air Force Reserve?
The first thing that happened with, I think I got my commission in the United States Air Force. See, I'd been in the Army Air Force until right after the war, and then they changed the name. And I got my commission when I got out of the service as a staff judge advocate in the United States Air Force. And then the Korean War came along, and they were calling a whole lot of us back to active duty to go into the Korean War. And I was notified that I had to meet the board, and if I didn't justify some reason for not going, I was going to be back in active duty. And I went before this colonel, and he said, now, Rucker, what's your excuse for not going in? Sort of rough sort of a fellow. He said, what's your excuse for not going? I said, well, I've got 4 dependents, and if I read the regulations, they don't want people to come back in. They've got 4 dependents. They get killed, they got 4 dependents to support. So that was a justification for deferment. And he said, well, I don't see 3 defendants. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, there's only 3 here. He said, there was one born last October. This was in November. October a year ago. No, he said, there's one born in November a year ago, and then you've got 2 back there. So you've only got 3 dependents. And I said, yeah, but I've got another one born, and this was, I said, in November, last month. He said, look, he said, you mean you had one daughter born in November of 1949 and another one born in October of 1950? I said, yes, sir, they're just 11 months apart. And he sort of glared at me and made a sort of bad remark and said, okay, I guess you're exempt. That's my reason for, not my reason, but my justification for saying I never was called back during the Korean War. As a staff judge advocate, I went to Seward Air Force Base and did a lot of practice down there in helping the staff these judge advocates at Seward Air Force Base in their relationship with lawyers and judges here in Murfreesboro, and with people who had problems that needed solving. I had a lot of experience. I would go down on Saturday and Sunday, and then other times when they had something special, they'd call me. I'd leave the office at noon and go down there and stay a half a day and try to help solve their problems. I went to a number of different schools. They made it possible for me to be admitted to practice before the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeals. I never appeared for the Supreme Court or the United States Military Court of Appeals. But they made it. It was a very satisfactory relationship as far as I was concerned. I enjoyed it. I don't know that I made any great contributions except in that way. When Seward Air Force Base closed, then I quit.
Well, as you helped young airmen and their families and NCOs and officers with various personal problems they had, that was quite a contribution. Legal assistance is an important part of what judge advocates do, and serving the people who serve.
I wrote many a will for many a sergeant down there.
Now, civic activities, what about, I know that you've been involved with so much in this community down through the years in this county and bar association and so forth. Tell me about some of the things that you've done in the civic arena.
Well, of course, I say of course, anybody that was active eventually did his term as president of the Chamber of Commerce. It just kept going. And I was president of the Lions Club. I feel like that I, together with Tommy Martin, who was a Murfreesboro citizen who died 2 days ago, and several others, Mayor Jack Todd and Jack McFarland from the News Journal, and Al Mifflin from the bank, and Whitney Stegall, who's retired chancellor. All of us worked together in the 50s to bring industry to Rutherford County and on up into the 60s. And we really made this community different from Shelbyville and other surrounding towns that didn't bring in industry, that didn't have Middle Tennessee State University, and we were able to grow to where we are today. That's continued with a lot of other people, but we started that in the 1950s.
So in those early days when, in the late 40s, how big was Murfreesboro?
Well, I think in 1940 we had 44,000 people. And I think by 1970 we had 80, and I believe they claim we're going to be 160,000 this year.
In the county?
In the county, yeah.
Okay.
Did I say Murfreesboro?
Yeah, but I knew that you meant the county.
44,000 in the county.
And what industry was there, say, about 1950?
Well, we didn't have any. We bragged about the fact that we lived off of one another. And that's really the honest to goodness truth. We had a silk mill that made stockings. We had a red cedar factory that made cedar buckets and cedar chests. We had Carnation Milk Company, which took care of the cows' milk in this county, but we didn't have any industry.
Even though the cows didn't sweat.
Even though they didn't sweat, they gave milk, yes. We just didn't have it, and that's what we realized when we started. And there was a group that gradually enlarged to different groups, but most of us had come back from the war and realized that Murfreesboro was a fine town. But we didn't see any prospects of our children being able to stay here at all.
And now, of course, there's so much industry here with Nissan and
it's just
all of the activities in Laverne.
In fact, the ones that came in the 1950s, a lot of those are closed. Chromalox is closed. General Electric is not closed, but it's way down from what it used to be.
Samsonite is gone.
Samsonite is closed. Paramount Packaging is closed. Schwartzball Manufacturing Company closed. All of those, not all, but those are the ones that we got in 1950 that added and started the impetus for the growth of Murfreesboro.
Now, you served as president of the Bar Association, I believe.
Well, I think I served about 6, 7 years till finally the boy who was secretary, he and I got together and decided we weren't going to let him impose on us anymore. We'd been president and secretary from the late 40s to the mid 50s, and we decided it's time for somebody else to do it. And I guess I was vice president of the state association one year. I guess I have the fallacy of having what I think are good stories about things that happened to me. How did I happen to get to be elected vice president of the state? I didn't get out and want to do it. I had been active in the Bar Association, but I hadn't been that strong. And I've talked with my sons and tried to see if they can help me remember the name of the man who nominated me. But for the life of me right now, he at one time was Secretary of the Supreme Court, very short time. And he was from the other side of Nashville. And I had known him, but not well. And we were in the Hermitage Hotel and went down to the restroom together. And he said, "John, I'm going to nominate you for vice president of the Bar Association tomorrow morning." Now, back then, you just came and stayed at the Bar Association, and on Saturday morning, those that were still there elected the officers. That's the way it was, sure enough. And I said, "Well, that'd be real nice, but these people don't know me. They're from all over the state." And he said, "No, I'm going to nominate you." So Saturday morning, we were all seated up there. And then when I came to nominate the vice president from Middle Tennessee, and my friend stood up and he said, "Now I'm going to nominate the finest young man in Middle Tennessee. He's done a lot of work for the Bar Association. He's a great man. He'll make a great contribution, and it's my pleasure to place in nomination for vice president for Middle Tennessee, he couldn't think of my name." And one of the lawyers sitting on the first row said in a whisper, "John Rucker." Yeah, John Rucker from Murfreesboro. His hand just hung up in the air. And they laughed. That was a joke for years about how Rucker got elected to vice president by a man that didn't even know his name.
What changes do you see in the practice of law that have been particularly significant over the years?
Well, I've already mentioned one thing is the idea of lawyers being paid almost strictly by the hour. Of course, I realize it's entirely different from what it was 30, 40 years ago. And the people who employed you knew who you were, and I'm talking about in a town like Murfreesboro. If they wanted you as their lawyer, they knew you were going to charge them a reasonable fee, or they wouldn't have come in the first place. And you might charge based on hours, or you might charge on the success of the litigation. And if you represented somebody and did an outstanding job in representing them, and I'm talking about courtroom practice, if you did them a good job at representing in court, why, you'd charge a reasonable fee. If you lost, you'd cut it back a little bit and say, "Well, I wasn't successful." But now that's all out now. And I have a feeling that we've gotten too much on the idea of how many hours can we put in. A young lawyer comes into a law office and you say to him, "Well, you're going to go to work for us. Now be sure and keep your hours." And you realize that we've got to have so many hours or we won't have the money to pay your fees while you're building up your practice. And that's wrong. I don't know what the answer is, but that's wrong.
What do you foresee for the practice of law in the future?
I think it may well get to independent lawyers not working for companies, big companies and all, may have difficulty in maintaining their standard of living, particularly in relatively small towns. Now, Murfreesboro has gotten to be a bigger town now, and so it's a little bit different. But the lawyers in Woodbury, Shelbyville, McMinnville, Coffee County, all around, I don't know how they're going to make a living, because the big companies and the people that have litigation there. And again, you remember I'm talking mostly about litigation. I know that there are lawyers who never litigate at all, who do the practice in their office, who do an entirely different type of practice. I'm commenting primarily on lawyers who are appearing in court and trying cases and settling cases.
What about captive law firms, where the law firms now work just for one particular insurance company? Any thoughts or comments about that?
Yeah, well, somebody might say, John, that's sour grapes on your part, because we have recently lost one of our biggest clients, insurance company, who's got their in-house counsel now that's coming to Murfreesboro and all around Middle Tennessee. And if you want to say that's sour grapes, it's sour grapes. But I can't believe that these lawyers who live in Nashville and never come to Murfreesboro except to try a lawsuit, never come to Warren County to try a lawsuit, except to try a lawsuit, can do as good a job representing these big companies and insurance companies I'm referring to, as well as a lawyer who's in Murfreesboro, who knows the area here. And I think it's bad. I don't say it's bad. Maybe it is, because that's what I've been doing all these years. I haven't done it recently, but what I did do.
Finally, let me just ask you about any hobbies or activities that you've pursued over the years. I know about one in particular.
I guess somebody must have told you that. And I do have a hobby, and it's a very good hobby. It's a good, clean hobby, and it's one that I've enjoyed for, I think I figured up 37 years. I started in 1963. I had a friend who owned a radio station here in Murfreesboro, and also a radio station in McCook, Nebraska. Now, how he happened to own one up there and one here, I'll never know. But he stopped me one day and said, you want to go to McCook, Nebraska with me next week? I've got to go up and look at my radio station. I said, why should I go to McCook, Nebraska? He said, because the pheasant season will open next Saturday, and we go up there and we can go pheasant hunting. Now, I'd been a huntsman all my life. I'd gone dove hunting, I'd gone rabbit hunting, I'd gone quail hunting. And I said, well, yeah, I'd just love to go. So we started and went up there, three of us, and we went pheasant hunting, and I have not missed a year since 1963 of going pheasant hunting, not always to McCook, Nebraska. Now we're going to Chamberlain, South Dakota. And if I add about 3 years that I went twice, I guess I've gone 40 times in the last 37 years and haven't missed a year. So my sons say to me, Dad, when are you going to quit? I said, and that's another thing. They both became interested in it, and they go with me every year. We have a group, it varies in who they are, but we have a group that goes every year. It's usually the last week in October, the first week in November, and we go to the same place now, have been for 20 years. They go with me. They close up Rucker and Rucker. Everybody knows Rucker and Rucker closes the first weekend in November while they go pheasant hunting. And I feel proud and happy with the fact that they both enjoy it as much as I do and have gone like I have.
Any particular trip that resulted in any special memories that stands out amongst the at least many, many fun times that you all had?
Well, I really can't.
They were just all great.
We moved from one place to another, and finally we got a guide in 1980, 81 I believe, and we've been going with him ever since then. You go out, and the things that you remember are the times that you get out in the field, and instead of one or two cock pheasants coming up and somebody shooting and somebody else shooting and all, 10 or 15 or 20 of them will come up. And you remember, you only kill the rooster pheasants, not the hens. And you have to be able to pick them out when they come up. If you kill a hen, you're in bad shape. And to see that, and to watch and see different ones shoot and knock down, sometimes somebody will kill two of them. It's a great thrill for me. I still enjoy it. The good Lord lets me live long enough. I'm going to keep on going. I'm planning to go this year.
Wonderful. Anything that I haven't asked you about that you wanted to share with the people who'll be watching this tape in the days and
I guess
months and years to come?
the only thing that I can say is that the good Lord has been good to me and let me live in a community like Murfreesboro and Rutherford County. And I appreciate the fact that I've had that opportunity to live here. My family has always supported me, and in anything that I did, Betty would go with me when I was running for public office. She'd hand out cards just like everybody else. And Jock gave up a week or two in Smyrna when he was in Memphis when he was in law school to come back and help me run for the state senate. And the fact that the family has been able to live here in Murfreesboro, one daughter living in Franklin, the rest of them all here, it has made me feel that I have had a very fortunate life, and for that I'm grateful.
You mentioned the Lord and His blessings of you. What about your connection with the church and religious affiliation down through the years?
I go to the Presbyterian Church with my wife, Betty, and I guess I'm not an active church member. That would be the way I would describe myself. I go to the church, and but I'm not an active. I'm not a deacon and that sort of thing.
But you've been active and faithful there down through the years.
Yes, I go to the First Presbyterian Church.
Any other special memories or things you want to share with the folks?
I can't think of them. I've looked down at some notes here, and I can't. I think you've let me tell the things that have interested me in life. I wish I was smart enough to be able to say this is what I think the judicial system should do and should go to. I think we have a good judicial system. I know Rutherford County has fine judges and a good system. I know the lawyers here are good lawyers, and I don't know of any ones that I would say is not the proper person to be a lawyer. I don't feel the close relationship with the number of lawyers we have now that I felt when I started. There were 19 lawyers in Rutherford County when I started. What are there now? 150?
About more like 200.
200. Yeah, when we moved over on the north side of the square, Rucker and Rucker moved from really right where this building is. We were on Vine Street, right where we are now. And when we moved over there on the north side of the square, there were no lawyers. And my two sons and I moved over there with the first lawyer. Now there are 22 lawyers in that one block on the square. I wish I was smart enough to tell them what I think they do. I don't have a close feeling with lawyers anymore. Maybe my personal activities and obligations don't permit me to do that like I used to. But I don't feel close to lawyers. I don't feel close to judges. I used to always feel very close. And so I regret. I think that's part of what made the law practice great for me and what made me enjoy life. If I'd been in Nashville, I don't believe I would have enjoyed it as much as I have here.
Well, Senator, we certainly appreciate your taking the time out from your schedule to not only participate in this interview, but to prepare for it, as I know you have. You've looked back and made notes, reminisced about the past. You've done what I have in preparation. You've talked with your sons and you've talked with other people about special events of the past. And on behalf of the Tennessee Bar Foundation, I want to thank you for being one of our interviewees this year, and I look forward to many more occasions to be with you in the years to come. And thank you again for your service to the bar and to the people of Tennessee.
I was very honored to be asked.